I never thought that rainy November night would turn into one of the most disturbing experiences of my life. I worked late in a small town in the countryside, and the way back home was a side road surrounded by trees that were already losing their autumn leaves. The floor was covered with wet leaves that the wind dragged from one side to the other, making direction even more difficult. The fine rain hit the windshield, and the headlights reflected that strange glow on the wet asphalt, creating shadows that seemed to move by themselves. I was already used to driving in that dark stretch, but that night there was something different. Maybe it was the absolute silence of the road, or the weight of the rain that seemed to fall harder every time I moved forward. The cleaner could barely handle it, and I felt tense, forcing my eyes to distinguish anything ahead. That's when I noticed something out of the ordinary on the side of the road. A dark silhouette was crouched, almost mixed with the carpet of soaked leaves, and for a moment I thought it was an animal. I instinctively slowed down, thinking it could be someone fallen or in need of help. As the headlights illuminated the scene better, it became clear that it was not an animal. The figure had the shape of a person, curved in a strange way, as if she were resting with her hands on the ground. The detail that froze me was the movement. At the exact moment the car approached, that figure began to crawl towards me, scratching the floor with something that looked like a slow and forced movement. My heart raced. By reflex, I stepped harder on the brake, but soon realized the mistake. Stopping in that isolated place was the last thing I should do. The headlights reflected directly on the crawling human form, and I could see that there was no umbrella, raincoat, nothing. Just a soaked body, which seemed oblivious to the cold and the water that flowed down the asphalt. The movement was slow, but decisive, as if the person had only one goal, to reach my car. At this point, everything inside me screamed to leave. I hit the first gear and accelerated again, trying to pass fast without looking too much to the sides. But against my will, I turned my face for a second and clearly saw that figure raising one of his arms and hitting the floor, as if he wanted to stop me from continuing. The muffled sound of the blows on the wet asphalt reached me even with the heavy rain and the engine accelerating. I moved on, but the image didn't leave my mind. I could still see through the rearview mirror the strange, almost convulsive movements of the figure trying to get up, but falling again. It was impossible not to think if it could be someone really in need of help. At the same time, there was something deeply wrong in that scene. It didn't seem like the behavior of a person in normal despair. It seemed something more disturbing, as if it were a trap or someone out of his mind. My whole body was shaking, and every kilometer traveled, I felt more torn between going back to check and continuing to run away from that disturbing vision. I thought about calling the police, but the cell phone didn't get a signal on that stretch of the road. The feeling of impotence was suffocating. My eyes constantly returned to the mirrors, hoping to see headlights of another car, or even that figure following me in some impossible way. I spent the rest of the journey in a state of absolute alert. Every shadow seemed like a threat. Every curve seemed to hide someone waiting for me. The rain only increased, and the leaves stuck to the ground produced that annoying noise under the tires. I couldn't think of anything other than the scene I had just witnessed, and the more I remembered the details, the more I convinced myself that it hadn't been just any pedestrian asking for help. When I finally got home, already at dawn, I parked the car in the garage and stood a few minutes in the driver's seat, trying to catch my breath. The bench was wet with cold sweat, and my hands were still shaking so much that I could barely hold the keys. I locked all the doors and windows immediately, as if that figure could have followed me in some invisible way there. The next morning, I called the local police station and described what I had seen. The policeman on the other end of the line listened to everything calmly, but in the end he said that it must probably be some drunk or lost homeless person. The explanation seemed logical, but something inside me didn't accept it. There was nothing natural in that creeping movement, nor in the way the figure reacted to the presence of my car. To this day, every time I go through that stretch, even during the day, I feel my heart tighten. I've never seen anything like it again, but the fear of that night is still alive in my memory. I always wonder what would have happened if I had really stopped, gotten out of the car and approached that figure. Would you be here to tell this story now? And the question that torments me the most: who or what crawled towards me on that road covered with leaves on that rainy November night? Story 2. I live in a quiet suburban street, where the houses are practically all the same. Low fences, backyards full of trees, and that typical silence that is only interrupted by dogs barking from time to time. I've always considered myself lucky to live in a quiet place, but on that rainy autumn night I realized that even the most common place can turn into something scary. A storm started in the middle of the night, with thunders so strong that they made the windows tremble. The wind blew irregularly, pushing branches against the roof and spreading leaves down the street. I was already lying down, trying to go back to sleep, when I heard a metallic sound coming from the backyard. It was like a continuous creak, a noise of rusty chains being tensioned. I recognized it immediately. It was the wooden swing that was stuck in the tree at the bottom of the backyard. The problem is that night, the wind didn't seem to be blowing hard enough to move that heavy swing. I hesitated before getting up, but the curiosity was greater than the fear at that moment. I took courage, walked to the bedroom window, and pulled the curtain lightly. What I saw left me paralyzed. The swing moved back and forth in a rhythmic way, as if someone was really sitting on it. It was not a random movement caused by the wind. It was slow and rhythmic, swinging exactly like when my niece played with it on Sunday afternoons. My heart raced, and I felt a chill go up my spine. While trying to find an explanation, I noticed something even more disturbing. The earth below the swing, which was soaked in rain, showed shoe marks. They were appearing one after the other, as if someone was walking there at that very moment. The problem is that there was no one sitting on the swing, at least not that I could see. The chains creaked louder and louder, and each snap seemed to echo inside my chest. I instinctively moved away from the window, trying to convince myself that it was just an illusion caused by the darkness and the storm. But a part of me knew it wasn't that simple. I decided to turn on the light in the room, as if it could somehow drive away what was happening outside. The clarity illuminated the curtain, but when I looked again, the swing was still moving. The sound of the creak seemed even louder now, mixed with the noise of the rain. I took the cell phone to try to film, or at least record that moment, but the battery was at the end, and the camera took a long time to open. In this interval, I swear I saw something move at a glance between the trees in the backyard. It wasn't clear enough to identify, just a bigger shadow than usual, passing too fast. The swing, however, did not stop, and the marks in the mud seemed to get deeper. It was as if someone invisible had real weight on that floor. My first reaction was to want to go down and check the doors, make sure everything was locked. While I was doing this, I realized that my hands were shaking so much that I could barely turn the key to the back door lock. Everything was locked, but I didn't feel safe. The house, which always transmitted peace to me, suddenly seemed too fragile in the face of what was happening a few meters away. I felt as if anything could go through the walls and enter. I went back to the room, but I didn't have the courage to approach the window again. I sat on the edge of the bed, hugging my knees, trying not to panic. Even from afar, I could hear the metallic sound, that constant rhythm that didn't make sense in the middle of the storm. I tried to cover my ears, but the noise seemed to infiltrate me, as if my body knew that something abnormal was happening and refused to ignore it. The minutes seemed like hours. At a certain moment, the swing stopped suddenly, without decreasing little by little as it would be normal. It was as if something had held the chains and interrupted the movement at once. The silence that followed was even worse. The rain kept falling, the thunder still echoed, but that sound that accompanied me had disappeared. I held my breath, waiting for what would come next. And it came too fast. A loud stampede on the window made me jump out of bed. I ran to the corridor with my heart racing. When I came back to look at it, I saw only the mark of a wet hand on the glass. The fingers flowed slowly, leaving traces of water as if someone had pressed their hand there hard. There was no way that could have happened without someone being outside. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That a swing was moving by itself, and that invisible hands were hitting my window? I ended up calling my sister, even though I knew she couldn't do anything. Just hearing the voice of someone I knew already helped me not to go crazy. While talking to her, I went to the living room and stood on the couch, facing the locked door, with all the lights in the house on. Gradually, the storm began to decrease, but the relief did not come. Even when the wind stopped and the sound of the rain tamed, I still felt that there was something watching me from the backyard. I couldn't explain, but the feeling was so intense that I didn't have the courage to sleep that night. I stayed awake until the sun rose, walking around the house as if I were an improvised watchman. The next morning, when I finally got up the courage to open the back door, I saw what was left of the night before. The mud under the swing was full of footprints, coming and going in circles. They were deep marks, as if a person had spent hours walking there, but none of the nearby trees had signs of someone having leaned or climbed to enter. The gate was still locked. No logic explained that. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. The swing is still in the backyard, but I could never look at it the same way again. I often wonder, what if I had gone down to check while the chains creaked? What would I have found under that tree? Story 3. I went with 3 friends to spend a weekend in a cabin in the countryside to try to disconnect from the city routine. It was autumn, and the road there was already complicated because the rain fell nonstop and the soaked leaves made the path slippery. The cabin looked very common on the outside, made of old wood and with a covered balcony. The owner left the key in a pot next to the door and sent a simple map showing the distribution of the rooms. When we entered, it seemed cozy. Small living room with fireplace, basic kitchen, 2 bedrooms side by side and a bathroom. There was nothing strange at first sight. That night, we had a simple dinner, played some cards and tried to ignore the wood chips caused by the rain hitting hard on the roof. The power failed a few times, but the fireplace helped keep the environment illuminated. Around 2 in the morning, we decided to collect ourselves. Each one stayed in a room, and despite the wind, we even managed to fall asleep quickly. It was a few hours later that I woke up with a very strong smell, which I immediately associated with fire smoke. I jumped out of bed scared and realized that my friends were also moving. Everyone woke up practically at the same time, coughing, confused, and trying to understand where that heavy smell came from. The curious thing is that, despite the strong odor, there was no sign of fire, no visible smoke in the air, no excessive heat, nothing. We went straight to the living room to check the fireplace, but it was off since before we went to sleep. The smell, however, seemed more intense on one of the walls of the corridor. We followed together to the back of the cabin, trying to identify the origin. That's when we noticed a wooden door, unlike the others, locked with a rusty padlock. The detail is that this door was not on the map left by the owner. We were silent for a few seconds, just looking at each other, trying to process what that meant. From behind that door came the strongest smell, as if something had burned in there hours before. The first reaction was to think about calling the owner of the cabin, but we had no cell phone signal, which was already expected in that isolated area. One of my friends suggested breaking down the door, but no one had the courage to take the first step. The noise of the rain on the roof seemed to increase the tension even more. We stood there, debating in whispers, as if we were afraid of drawing attention to something that could be on the other side. The smell continued to impregnate, to the point of burning in the nose. We tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, but it was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I had the feeling that the smoke was spreading invisibly around the house. The worst was when, at a certain moment, we heard a loud snap, like burning wood, coming exactly from that direction. One of my friends swore he saw a thread of smoke escape through the crack in the door. The clock was almost 4 in the morning, and no one dared to approach again. We decided to stay in the room until dawn, everyone awake and silent, just listening to the sounds of the cabin. The rain decreased and increased in intensity, but it never stopped. Every time we looked at the corridor, that door seemed even more out of place, as if it were a piece of another world stuck inside a common construction. The smell didn't disappear, it even seemed to impregnate our clothes and hair. When it finally dawned, we gained courage to inspect more calmly. We used flashlights, since the electricity was unstable, and we approached the locked door. We tried to force the padlock with a piece of kitchen iron, but it didn't give in. We decided to look outside, to see if there was any window or secondary entrance to that room. We went around the whole cabin, but nothing indicated that there was a room there. The wall was smooth, no windows, no protrusions, nothing. This only increased the dread we already felt. How could there be a door to a room that was not on the map and that, on the outside, simply did not exist? The smell of smoke seemed to have weakened throughout the morning, but did not completely disappear. One of my friends insisted that we should leave at that very moment, but the other 2 wanted to at least wait for the owner to arrive to ask. I was torn between curiosity and the desire to escape. We ended up packing our things and leaving them ready, in case something worse happened. We spent the rest of the day uncomfortable, avoiding the corridor and trying to distract the mind. When it got dark again, the rain came back even stronger. It was almost immediate. The smell returned, as strong as the first night, coming out exactly from the locked door. This time, in addition to the smell, we heard light steps coming from inside. It was enough to decide we wouldn't spend another night there. We left in a hurry, carrying our bags in the middle of the storm. We put everything in the car and left without even turning off the cabin lights. When we were already on the road, A few kilometers away, the smell seemed to continue to be impregnated in the car, as if it had followed us. We hardly talked all the way back, each one trying to process what had happened. To this day, when I remember that locked door and the smell of smoke that came out of nowhere, I feel a deep chill. We never found out what was in that room, and we didn't even have the courage to ask the owner afterwards. It was like a mystery, but one that we prefer not to solve. I always wonder, what would have happened if we had broken down that door that first night? Maybe we should never know. Story 4. I rented a chalet in the countryside to spend a few days alone, trying to rest from the rush of the city. The place was in a region surrounded by trees, with few houses nearby. On the first day, I realized that there was a construction very close, a large and old house, which seemed abandoned. The windows were dark, part of the roof was down, and the grass grew tall, with no signs of recent care. No one passed by during the day, and everything led me to believe that the property had been empty for years. During the first 2 nights, nothing happened. I took the opportunity to read and listen to music, even with the noise of the constant rain. However, on the 3rd night, something caught my attention. It was around 10, and a storm began to form, with thunder echoing in the mountains. When I looked out the living room window, I noticed that the neighboring house, until then always erased, was lit. Strong lights came from the windows downstairs and, soon after, also from the upstairs windows. At first, I thought that maybe someone had arrived to take care of the property. But the more I watched, the stranger the scene seemed. The lights were not uniform, they blinked as if they were very old lamps, and I clearly noticed shadows moving inside the rooms. They were not fast movements, but figures walking from one side to the other slowly, as if they were occupying the house normally. That made me cold because during the day, the construction seemed totally abandoned. I stood at the window for several minutes, trying to find some logical explanation. Was I wrong when I thought the house was empty? Maybe someone would have moved without the owner of the cottage having told me. But at the same time, it was impossible to ignore the details. Broken roof, dusty windows, garden taken over by bush. It didn't make sense for someone to live there without having done any minimal renovations. Even so, the lights were there, shining like in any other residence. When the thunder got stronger, I decided to get away from the window and try to distract myself. But curiosity was greater than fear. I looked again minutes later, and the shadows were still visible. One of them stopped near a window, and for a moment, I had the feeling that she was also watching me. I hid behind the curtain immediately, my heart racing, as if I had been caught spying. I didn't hear anything but the rain, but the idea of someone or something looking back at me didn't leave my head. The next morning, the first thing I did was walk to the fence that separated my cottage from that house. I wanted to confirm if there was really activity inside, but the vision was even more disturbing. The windows were broken, full of cobwebs, the interior dark and empty. No sign of furniture, lamps, or that someone had been there. If the lights had really turned on, there was no trace of electricity working in that place. I spent the day trying to convince myself that maybe it was just a reflection, or an illusion caused by the storm. But when night fell again, and the rain returned even stronger, the scene repeated itself. Out of nowhere, the lights of the neighboring house came on. First the downstairs, then the upstairs. And again, the shadows moved from one side to the other, as if it were a family walking around the house. This time, I didn't have the courage to look for a long time. I went back to the room and closed the curtains, but the light still passed through the cracks, dimly illuminating the interior of the cottage. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the shadows leaving the house and crossing the land until I reached the balcony where I was. I couldn't sleep well. I kept waking up to every noise, every thunder, convinced that someone could be approaching. The fear of hearing knocks on the door was so great that I even left a chair locking the handle. On the 3rd night, I was already on alert from the beginning. I prepared strong coffee to not sleep and left the internal lights all on. But when I looked out the window, the lights of the neighboring house were already on before the storm even started. This made me even more nervous, because it seemed that it happened in a pattern that did not depend on the rain, but on some cycle that I did not understand. And the shadows seemed more agitated than before, as if they were aware that I was watching them. I thought about calling the owner of the cottage and asking about that house, but again there was no cell phone signal. With each lightning, I saw more clearly the figures passing from one side to the other, some stopping near the windows. I hid behind the curtain again, but it was as if the feeling of being watched was impossible to avoid. The tension became so unbearable that I started packing my things at dawn. As soon as it dawned, I couldn't take it anymore. I put the bags in the car and left before even returning the key at the indicated door. I didn't look back while driving, but in the rearview mirror it still seemed that the lights of the neighboring house were shining, even with the sun rising. I didn't tell my friends anything. I just figured out that I had anticipated the trip because I wasn't feeling well. To this day, I can't explain what I saw. Maybe it was really someone occupying the house irregularly, but nothing justified the state of abandonment it was in during the day. The lights, the shadows, everything happened only at night and only during the rain. I always wonder if that would have ended if I had stayed longer, or if it would have gotten worse. What would you do in my place? Would you investigate more closely or run away like I did? Story 5. I came home late at night after an exhausting day at work. It was raining hard, that typical autumn rain that doesn't give a break, leaving the windshield always blurred even with the air conditioning on. The road was practically deserted, and only from time to time I crossed with a car coming in the opposite direction. It was in this scenario that I noticed something strange. A woman walking alone along the edge of the track, soaked, without an umbrella, without a backpack, nothing. At the time, I slowed down a little to look better. She seemed to be wearing ordinary clothes, nothing flashy, but the way she walked made me uneasy. She wasn't in a hurry, she didn't try to protect herself from the rain. She just moved on with firm and heavy steps, as if she didn't care about the storm. I passed by her slowly, trying to see if she needed help, but what scared me was the fact that she didn't mention asking for a ride or waving. She simply kept his gaze fixed on the front. I kept driving, but I couldn't stop thinking about her. Who would be walking on that road at that time, in that rain, without any kind of protection? The stretch had no wide shoulder, no shops or houses nearby, only trees on both sides and some old signs indicating distant exits. Everything seemed strange. Still, I forced my mind to forget, telling myself that maybe it was someone coming back from somewhere nearby. It was about 10 minutes by road until I reached an intersection illuminated by an old pole. And it was exactly at this point that the fear really hit me. Leaning against the side of the road, standing in front of my car, was the same woman. Soaked, motionless, just looking at me. There was no way she got there on foot before me. There were no shortcuts. My heart raced, and my hands shook on the steering wheel. I passed by the intersection without being able to look away from her. The headlights lit up the woman's face for a few seconds, but she looked too pale, almost expressionless. What made me most nervous was realizing that, even with the rain beating hard, she didn't blink, didn't raise her hands, didn't move. He just followed me with his eyes while I drove. It was as if he was already waiting for me. After I passed, I was afraid to look in the rearview mirror. You know that feeling that if you look, you'll see something you shouldn't? I held the steering wheel tightly, accelerating a little more than I should. The sound of the tires cutting the water mixed with the noise of the rain on the roof of the car. I was completely alone, and the only thing that came to my mind was, how did she get there so fast? I tried to convince myself that it could be someone else, maybe just similar, but it was useless. The clothes, the way they behave, even the way the hair was glued to the face because of the water. It was the same woman. After that crossing, I couldn't relax anymore. I started staring at the road, avoiding facing anything around, as if that was the only way to stay safe. A few kilometers later, I began to feel that pressure in my chest of someone who knows that something is wrong. I didn't see anyone else on the road, but I was sure that if I slowed down, I would end up seeing the woman again somewhere further ahead. It was as if I was being tested, as if I shouldn't stop for anything. I kept driving without the courage to stop anywhere. When I finally reached the exit to my city, I took a deep breath. The heart was still racing, but the road was already more familiar. I entered the urban perimeter, and the movement of some cars brought me a momentary relief. I parked in front of the house, still sweating cold, looking around to make sure I was alone. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away immediately. That night, I could barely sleep. The scene of the woman standing on the side of the road didn't leave my mind. I relived the image of her staring at me, motionless, as if it were something impossible to forget. It was unlike anything I'd ever been through on the road. And to this day, whenever I take this same path on rainy days, I can't help but look to the sides, afraid of meeting that figure again. I never found out who she was, or if she really was a person. I asked some colleagues who lived nearby, and no one could tell me about women walking alone at night for that stretch. With every report I find on the internet about people who disappear on the side of the road, I wonder if it wasn't something similar to what I saw. I don't want to believe it was something supernatural, but logic doesn't give me a better answer. To this day, I wonder what would have happened if I had stopped, if I had lowered the glass to talk to her. Was it just someone in need of help, or was there something much worse that night? And you, in my place, would you have stopped to offer a ride, or would you have done like me, stepped on and moved on? Story 6. I rented an old country house to spend a few days of rest during the fall. The place was isolated, surrounded by trees that were already almost all covered by the reddish colors of the season. I wanted some time away from the city, enjoying the silence and the cold weather, even if the house was older than I expected. From the first night, I noticed that the wood creaked at every step and that the wind seemed to enter through invisible cracks, but nothing that bothered me to the point of giving up. Until the third night arrived, when everything changed. It had been raining hard since the end of the afternoon, and I was already used to the noise of the leaks hitting the porch eaves. However, around 11 at night, I began to hear a different sound. It was as if the water was dripping inside the house, but not in a corner of the downstairs. The sound came from above, from the attic. At first, I thought maybe there was some broken tile, and the water was leaking right inside. I took the flashlight, even against my will, and went up the stairs that led to the trapdoor. When I pushed the attic lid, I felt a cold and humid wind hitting my face. I pointed the flashlight inside and saw that the wooden floor was completely soaked, as if it had rained in there. But the first thing that gave me goosebumps was noticing that the roof was intact. There were no leaks, cracks, nothing that justified that much water. It was as if it had rained only in that room. I entered, already uncomfortable, and closed the trapdoor behind me. As I walked slowly, the wet wood made a snot under my feet. The smell of mold and humidity was unbearable, so strong that it seemed that the attic had been closed for decades. I passed the light through the corners and saw nothing but old boxes stacked, all soaked by water, but one thing soon caught my attention. Right in the center of the attic, there was a wooden rocking chair, completely wet. The strangest thing is that she was facing the stairs, as if someone had been there waiting for me. I was paralyzed for a few seconds, watching that scene. The chair seemed out of place, as if it didn't belong to that place. There was no dust accumulated on it, unlike the boxes and beams around it. I got closer, but every step seemed wrong, as if I was invading something I shouldn't. I touched the chair quickly with the tip of the flashlight and noticed that it was cold, soaked, as if it had just been left outside in the rain. But what bothered me the most was the way she was positioned, facing me, as if facing the trapdoor. A chill ran down my spine when I realized that, despite not having really touched the chair, it swayed slightly. I don't know if it was the effect of my already nervous mind or if some wind had passed, but the attic had no open windows, and the roof, as I had already seen, was firm. The movement was so subtle that I almost doubted I had seen it, but I couldn't ignore it. It was impossible not to feel that something there was deeply wrong. At that moment, a different noise made me freeze. It was like a long creak of wood, coming from the dark corner, near some boxes. I aimed the flashlight in that direction, but I only saw shadows, nothing that justified the sound. Still, I had the feeling that I wasn't alone up there. My ears caught a heavy silence, interrupted only by the noise of the rain hitting the roof. An intact roof, but it seemed to let all the water fall into that space. Fear began to take over me in a way that was difficult to explain. I didn't know if I was going down immediately, or if I was trying to understand what was happening. Rationality said that it didn't make any sense, that maybe there was some hidden leak, but nothing explained the chair. I looked at her once again, and I swear I had the impression that she was a little closer to the stairs than before. The idea of turning my back and being followed by that object made me almost panic. I squeezed the flashlight hard and took a few steps back. My breathing was accelerated, and I could already hear my own heart beating in my ear. Every second I stayed there seemed like a challenge to my sanity. I closed my eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and decided I wasn't going to risk it anymore. With quick movements, I pulled the trapdoor and went down the stairs as fast as I could, almost stumbling. The feeling of being watched from above didn't leave me until I reached the room. When I got downstairs, I locked the trapdoor with the rusty lock that was on the side. The rain was still heavy, but inside the house the sound seemed muffled, as if something had been held up there. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the living room, with all the lights on, without the courage to sleep. Each creak of the wood made my body freeze, and the image of the wet chair facing the stairs did not leave my head. The next morning, I took courage to go up again, believing that the daylight would bring me some logical explanation. But when I opened the trapdoor, the floor was completely dry. The boxes, which were soaked hours before, were dusty as if they had never touched water. The rocking chair was still there, but clean and with no sign of moisture. I couldn't believe what I saw. It was as if everything had happened only in my head, but I knew I hadn't imagined. I left the house that same day. I didn't want to wait another night to confirm if that would happen again. To this day, when I remember that chair, I wonder if I would have found someone sitting on it if I had waited longer. I can't forget the image of the wet and silent attic, as if it were a space that should never have been opened. And you, in my place, would you have the courage to go up there alone on that rainy night? Story 7. I rented an isolated chalet to spend the weekend, just looking to rest and enjoy the silence away from the city. It was autumn and the rain fell hard from the afternoon, leaving the windows blurred and the roof creaking with every gust of wind. I took some books, food, and enough to spend 2 days without having to go out. The place was beautiful, surrounded by tall trees, and although it had a kind of forgotten air, I thought it would be perfect for a quick retreat. But that morning, I realized that the loneliness of the cottage was not exactly a relief. I was already lying down, trying to sleep with the sound of the rain, when I heard heavy knocks on the front door. They weren't light, like someone polite asking for a starter. They were strong, insistent knocks, as if the person was in a hurry. The sound echoed throughout the cottage, making the wooden floor vibrate slightly. I sat on the bed, with my heart racing, not understanding who could be there in the middle of the night in a place so far away. For a moment, I thought about ignoring it, but soon I heard a male voice, muffled by the sound of the rain, asking to come in. He said something like, "Please let me in, I just need shelter." The tone was strange, emotionless, repetitive, almost rehearsed. My whole body became tense. I didn't know anyone in that region, and on the road, I hadn't seen any movement that justified someone suddenly appearing at that time. I tried to look through the side window, but the darkness was almost total. The only lighting came from the occasional lightning, which left the courtyard in front visible for fractions of a second. In none of these flashes I could see the figure of the man, only the wet balcony and the trees swaying with the wind. I went back close to the door, and he knocked again, harder, repeating the same phrase. That's when I realized that the cottage didn't have very secure locks. The lock looked fragile, old, and the wooden door was already a little curved by the humidity. I felt vulnerable in a way I had never felt before. I held my cell phone and, without thinking twice, dialed the local police. I tried to keep my voice down, fearing that he would notice that I was on the phone. I explained the situation as fast as I could, that I was alone, in an isolated cottage, and that there was someone knocking on my door. On the other side, the attendant was silent for a few seconds that seemed eternal before answering. He said firmly that in that area there were no inhabited houses within a radius of 10 miles, that I should keep the door locked and not open it at all. The chill in my spine was immediate. While I was still on the call, the beats stopped. The voice was not heard again. The silence that followed was worse, because it left me without knowing where he was. I slowly walked away from the door, still trying to hear any signal outside. But the only thing that was coming was the noise of the rain, which seemed to further increase the feeling of isolation. I went back to the room, shaking, and sat on the edge of the bed with my cell phone in my hand. My hands were sweaty, and I couldn't stop looking at the bedroom door, wondering if someone could force the entrance of the cottage. I tried to rationalize, to tell myself that maybe I was just a lost traveler, but the policeman's words echoed in my head. There are no houses within a radius of 10 miles. After a few minutes, which seemed like an eternity, I heard heavy footsteps on the balcony deck, as if someone was walking slowly from one side to the other. There were no more knocks or requests, only steps, accompanied by the creaking of the wet wood under the weight. The sound came and went, until it stopped completely. I spent the rest of the night awake, without the courage to turn off the lights. Every shadow cast by lightning seemed like a threat. The clock was slow to move forward, and the fear that the beats would come back prevented me from even closing my eyes. The rain did not give a truce until dawn, and the constant noise only increased the tension, as if masking any other sound that could denounce his presence nearby. When it finally dawned, I gathered courage and opened the curtain in the living room to look at the balcony. The wooden floor was soaked, but there were no footprints, just irregular watermarks, as if someone had stood in front of the door for a long time. The feeling of being watched still accompanied me, even under the dim daylight. I left the cottage a few hours later, anticipating my return home. I didn't want to risk another night there. To this day, I don't know if there was really someone knocking on my door, or if my fear turned the storm into something more sinister. But I clearly remember the voice repeating those words and the confirmation from the police that there was no one living nearby. And you, would you open the door that night? Story 8. I always liked to sleep listening to the sound of the rain. That night seemed no different from the others, a typical autumn storm, with space thunder and the strong wind beating against the trees around the house. I closed all the windows before going to bed, as I always did, because my house was old and any crack let the cold in. I remember checking each of them, until I turned twice on the padlock of my bedroom window. Everything was locked and safe. I lay down quietly, thinking that I would have just one more ordinary night rocked by the sound of the storm. I woke up suddenly, with the feeling that something was wrong. The first detail that caught my attention was the intense cold, different from what I used to feel. When I opened my eyes, I realized that the curtains in my room were wet and attached to the parapet by the force of the wind. The window was wide open, and the rain came in straight, soaking the carpet and walls. For a second, I thought I had forgotten to lock it, but the memory of checking twice made me discard this idea. I got up immediately to close, already feeling the shirt stuck by the cold of the falling water. Still stunned, I walked through the house to check the other windows. That's when my stomach turned. Each room was the same. Open windows, curtains agitated by the wind and puddles of water forming on the floor. The room was especially wet, with water marks running down the walls, as if the storm had invaded the house for hours. The strangest thing was that none of the locks seemed broken. They were all intact, as if they had never been used, but I knew I had locked them tightly. As I closed the windows, I began to feel a weight in the air, as if I wasn't alone. It was difficult to distinguish normal storm sounds from possible steps or movements inside the house. Each stronger blow of the wind sounded like a suspicious noise. I went back to the main corridor, trying to take a deep breath and reason. I thought about calling someone, but it was almost 3 in the morning, and it didn't make sense to bother anyone with a story that would sound absurd. Even so, I couldn't get rid of the fear that someone had entered. I went to the back door to check if it was locked. The key was still in place, the way I left it before going to sleep. No sign of burglary. The same happened with the front door. All the entrances were safe, intact, but the wide open windows told a different story. With each lightning, I saw the reflection of my own frightened expression on the wet windows, and the feeling of being watched increased. I went back to the room and noticed something even more disturbing. On the windowsill, there were water marks that didn't come from the rain. They looked like irregular splashes, as if someone had supported their wet hands to lean over and look inside. It was impossible not to think that someone had been there, taking advantage of the darkness and the storm to invade, or worse, just observe. With the cell phone flashlight, I walked around the whole house once again. I didn't find anything out of place other than the water that was now accumulating on carpets and furniture. Still, at some points, such as in the upstairs corridor, there seemed to be more defined marks on the floor, as if wet feet had walked there. I followed the trail to the stairs, but he just disappeared halfway, without taking me anywhere. I spent the whole night awake, sitting on the sofa in the living room with the lights on, listening to the storm and trying to understand what had happened. Every time I closed my eyes, the memory of the open windows and the sensation of cold air cutting my skin when I woke up came to me. I couldn't accept that it was just a coincidence or carelessness. The meticulous way in which everything was gayed, but intact, didn't make any sense. When the sun rose, I was finally able to relax a little. The house looked different with daylight, but the damage was clear. Wet walls, stained furniture, and a smell of humidity that would take days to come out. I spent the morning cleaning and trying to occupy my mind, but every time I looked at the window locks, perfect and intact, I felt a chill that wouldn't go away. I told some friends, hoping to hear a logical explanation, but everyone reacted with disbelief. Some laughed, saying that I should have really forgotten to lock it. Others blamed the wind, saying that old houses always have cracks. But no one could explain why I would have left all the windows open, nor the different water marks I saw on the parapet of my room. The next night, I closed all the windows again, but I couldn't sleep. I spent hours lying down, staring at the ceiling, waiting to hear the curtains shake by the wind or the beating of the rain coming in. Nothing happened this time, but the feeling of vulnerability remained. It was as if, at any time, that could happen again. To this day, I can't say what happened that rainy dawn. If it was a cruel joke, if someone was really inside my house, or if it was something I just can't explain. All I know is that now, every night, I check the windows several times before going to sleep, and yet I could never really feel safe again. And could you sleep peacefully if you woke up with all the windows open like that? I'm really grateful for staying until the last minute. It's always good to know that you're here, listening to every detail. If you liked it, comment which part was the scariest for you. And of course, sign up to keep listening to stories as dark as this one. See you in the next video.